StoryHinge, Episode 81, Cathy O'Dowd, Life's Climb.
So the goal exists to make sure the journey has focus, but the value is the undertaking of the journey. And if it eventually deviates from the goal, that's just fine. That's essentially the nature of the game. I think that's those of us who do extreme sport, at least in my opinion, that's what's interesting about it. It is the management of risk. So you go onto a mountain with two objectives: getting to the top, coming home alive, preferably uninjured. You hope to do both. If you have to choose, you're going to choose coming home alive, but you've got to recognize the point at which the two goals begin to diverge. And I actually think it's one of the reasons we as a species like stories so much, because it imposes order on a life experience that is actually rather depressingly disordered and dysfunctional and, in my opinion, largely without conclusion. We make conclusion for ourselves.
Welcome to StoryHinge. At StoryHinge, we explore foundational ideas and beliefs. We believe everyone has a beautiful story to grow. Now here's your host, Jason Vidaurri.
All right, welcome everyone to StoryHinge. So excited today. Today we have on Cathy O'Dowd. Now Cathy is a South African mountaineer and has quite a story to share with us about her adventures up Mount Everest. And really it's not only that, but it's the story around that, and then the intersection of stories in our lives and how that we can really leverage those stories to improve lives. So with that, Cathy, welcome to StoryHinge.
I'm delighted to join you.
All right. Well, oftentimes we jump back into time a little bit here at StoryHinge and hear a little bit about some of those foundational things that led to where you're at today. And I guess with you, maybe going back to some of the beginnings of what led to this life of adventure as I see it.
Well, it certainly wasn't predestined. It wasn't something I expected or was, anticipating as a child. I grew up in the suburbs of Johannesburg, South Africa, huge grass plain. Parents, the most adventurous thing they did were day walks on the summer holidays. I got into mountains as a teenager, one of those summer camps. I got to hike and camp. I liked that. At university, I joined the rock climbing club, and for the first time in my life, I found a sport I was good at, having been dreadful at the sort of ladies' field sports that we did at school. But I was still struggling with my adult life. I mean, the climbing was wonderful, and I did more and more on holidays. I went to Central Africa and South America. I was doing alpinism as well as rock climbing. But it was just this somewhat expensive, esoteric holiday hobby. How do you make that a bigger part of your life and still pay the bills? I mean, my mother was a housewife, which seemed like a terrible idea because one of my strong lessons was women do need to make their own money. Otherwise, you're terribly vulnerable in life. And my father was a businessman in a terribly mysterious, suited, office desk, looked boring way. And I didn't know what else people did to make interesting adult lives.
Huh. And how did you go about exploring that? I guess one of my questions, it sounds like you're, like many of us, you're kind of searching and saying, well, I kind of want, this is interesting to me. This might not be interesting to me. Was there any pattern or way that you kind of started breaking that down?
Well, I did and I didn't. So I tried to pursue the things I liked in a sensible way, which sort of meant that I ended up studying journalism at university because I liked writing and I liked photography. Both of them I think of as kind of nonfiction storytelling. I can't take a blank canvas and make something out of nothing, but I can take life and turn it into, restructure it so it's more engaging. The way you take a photograph by picking the light, the composition, the elements. The way you write a story by taking life and finding a dramatic line and a start and a conclusion. But I didn't actually want to be a journalist. So I was doing that thing where you stay at university accumulating higher degrees because you're too scared to get into the job market. So I was finishing off a master's when I came across a newspaper story front page of our big Sunday newspaper, the first South African Everest expedition. And of course, they'd picked a bunch of men to go. So it was like, well, there's nothing there. Except that at the bottom, they decided, apparently, that this, I'm guessing, that this just wasn't all that interesting for a country that didn't really, take mountain climbing as seriously. They decided to make it more sexy for the media by running a competition to find a woman to join the team. And they did sort of present it as if the woman was going to be marched to the top like a flag and waved from the summit. Sort of, It didn't come across as a sensible way to find somebody to join a climbing team for a mountain like Everest. And I could see that it was stupid and sexist and contrived. And we didn't even have the word reality television back then, but this was early reality TV. But I just saw an opportunity, and not even Everest. They were going to take a shortlist to climb Kilimanjaro, and I thought I had a good shot at the shortlist, and I'd get a free climb up Kilimanjaro.
There you go. And so that, I guess that's, and I did read some of your book in hearing some of that debate within yourself about this, and I guess what struck me about that is that oftentimes all of us in our life, we come to these points where we have that fork in the road. Do I do this or do I do that? And I guess as I read your book, I felt that tension for you in that moment. Do I take this step? Do I go for it or not? Extract that out a little bit for our audience, and how, maybe some insights on how we approach those forks in the road and which one do we take?
Well, I think what I find interesting is people assume that anyone who climbs mountains must be terribly goal-orientated. And clearly I must have set Everest as my goal when I was 6 years old and blah, blah, blah. No, none of the above. I admire people who set 5-year goals, but I don't know how they do it, because I don't know what's going to happen in the next 5 years. There's so much opportunity in that time that I don't want to be rigidly stuck in some plan. I don't know. I don't have the focus for 5-year plans, let alone 20-year plans. I think of life as a river, and I'm sort of kayaking my way down it. And I've got some control over what direction I go in, but a lot of it is just happening to me. And so my philosophy is about seizing opportunities. So I didn't want to climb Everest. I wanted to go to the Himalaya. And I was looking for a way to get to the Himalaya, and Everest is in the Himalaya. It could have been any other mountain. I'd still applied. And having applied, I didn't think I'm going to conquer Everest. I thought, God, I've never climbed anything nearly that high. I'm going to do the best I can, go as far as I can. I am going to learn skills. I'm going to meet people. I'm going to be a better climber with a wider spread of knowledge than I was before I went on this trip. That was my aim. And if I'm lucky, I'll be able to climb to my limit, and I have some idea of kind of how far I can go on a mountain. So I'm into process. I'm into accumulating skills and experiences, not chasing goals.
That's interesting. That's good.
And for me, I admire people who create something out of nothing, the entrepreneurs of the world. And in the adventure space, they also they create great projects and great expeditions. But I don't feel that driven. I think I've done really well out of just seizing life's opportunities with the attitude that as long as I learn something, it doesn't matter whether the project succeeds or fails. I'll just be better off than I was before the opportunity came by.
I like that approach, because maybe I got some of this from your writing, that sometimes we judge very much. Did you succeed? Did you hit that end goal? Did you get an A on the test? And I think there's probably an overemphasis on that, because a lot of life is that adventure, like you're talking about, that process of going there. That's the growth and that's the development. And if we didn't get to the very end, well, that's okay. There's still a lot of development that we could have experienced along the way. Is that kind of what I'm hearing from your reflection?
I think
here?
That's very true. And I think it relates to education too. People think of education as you learn the thing, and then they complain, oh, that thing isn't relevant. Why do I have to learn that? Actually, education, we're learning how to learn. But the best way to do it is to be learning something specific. And I feel the same about climbing. I'm climbing because I enjoy the process. I think of it as puzzle solving, risk management, journeying. But the fact remains, I set a goal because that makes me journey in a specific direction. Otherwise, I could end up going around in circles. So the goal exists to make sure the journey has focus. But the value is the undertaking of the journey. And if it eventually deviates from the goal, that's just fine.
That's good. So how did this work out? I believe there's a selection process along the way, and how did you make it to be the one?
Well, I got onto the shortlist of 6. Out of the 6, I then got invited to join the Everest expedition. And this is where I think it's interesting as a story, because it sounds like a sort of fairy tale ending. Actually, it was horrendous. First of all, the men on the team were not at all happy to have this woman parachuted in this particularly sort of contrived way. Then the men on the team didn't get on with each other. So before we'd even left South Africa, there was conflict within the group, and it just got worse. We ended up with some spectacular infighting, some power plays that went wrong, and eventually 3 members of the expedition walked out before we even got to base camp.
Oh.
And all of this is playing out in public in the middle of the sort of the Nepalese wilderness. And there are, I don't remember, 11 or 12 expeditions on Everest that season. So by the time we arrived at base camp, we were notorious as the inexperienced South African expedition who, couldn't even get to base camp without having a screaming row and a bust-up fight. And all of this was thoroughly traumatic and confusing. And then we've got a journalist who thinks that, of course, this is great. Nothing like conflict or bad news stories. So the journalist is reporting the hell out of all of this negativity, which doesn't help. Frankly, he's feeding into it. So the whole thing's awful. And then we get onto Everest, and sort of the people who stay with the project pull together. So things get better. And we make our way up the mountain, up to the top camp. One of 4 teams who are kind of in a position to try and get to the summit based on a good weather report. The weather changes, not really bad, just enough to make us nervous. But we're the least experienced of these 4 teams. So apparently no one else is nervous. So they go. We stay because we're being cautious. They get to the summit, which is awful because we're lying in our sleeping bags listening to them, on the summit, celebrating. 2 of these teams on the summit are led by very famous international guides. And on the way down, there's a storm, an enormous storm. And by the time that storm ends, 5 people are dead, including both of the famous guides.
And this is the Everest story that we've heard of?
This is the notorious Everest story.
Okay.
This is the first time that Everest, this was right at the beginning of websites. It was probably the first season that Everest was connected via internet to the world. So it was the first time a mountain tragedy went viral as it was happening. It's a whole new experience in the world. And so Everest suddenly was on worldwide media, and we were in the middle of it, which is like bizarre. None of us had any training. No one had any training back then, how to deal with sort of viral internet notoriety. So now we're back at base camp. Everyone's giving up. Everyone's panicked. People have died. Should we go home? Huge downer. Then we decide to try again, very carefully. Halfway up the mountain, we get a telephone call of support from President Nelson Mandela. Like, okay, huge up again. Like, okay, literally sitting halfway up Everest talking via radio and phone to Nelson Mandela. We finally get to the top as the very last team of the season, 9 weeks on Everest. Get to the top. So like success snatched out of, the jaws of defeat. All very dramatic, story worthy. And then a member of our team is killed on the way down.
Oh.
So there's just like this huge whiplash change from triumph to tragedy. And we came home to just so much media coverage. Positive, negative, everyone had an opinion. Some people thought we were amazing. Some people thought we were selfish and suicidal and stupid. And everyone had an opinion. Everyone wanted to know, what's the inside story? What actually happened up there?
Oh, I'm sure. I guess when I think about that, you've probably been asked this before too, is like, sometimes it's probably the same question you got coming back, is like, on these real extreme adventure, really putting your life out there on the line, how do you evaluate that risk versus reward? Was there part of you saying, hey, there's just too much here. I could lose my life on this. Is it worth it just to get to the top of a mountain? I mean, how do you evaluate some of those risks that we look at as we move forward in life and say, well, this one's too risky, not risky, I should go for it or not?
That's essentially the nature of the game. I think that's, those of us who do extreme sport, at least in my opinion, that's what's interesting about it. It is the management of risk. So you go onto a mountain with two objectives: getting to the top, coming home alive, preferably uninjured. You hope to do both. If you have to choose, you're going to choose coming home alive, but you've got to recognize the point at which the two goals begin to diverge. And you've got to recognize how much tolerance you have for the two moving away from each other before you need to choose. I mean, that's hard. You operate in a gray area. These are not clear-cut decisions. You shouldn't be there if you hadn't realized you might get killed. And it doesn't have to be Everest. Yeah. People die on all sorts of mountains. People die in the wilderness in all sorts of ways. Just being in wild places carries risk. So you need to have thought that through. And how much are you prepared to risk? So I'm certainly risking something by doing these things. But on the other hand, my eldest brother died in a car crash at the age of 21. The car skidded on a wet road. He and his girlfriend were looking over their shoulders at a sunset. They were briefly distracted. It was the 70s. If he'd been wearing a seatbelt, he would have lived. But you didn't have to back then. So I don't actually think of life as this, it's better to wrap yourself in bubble wrap and sit on the sofa so that nothing possibly happens to you and you live as long as possible with this terribly boring life. Life is this gift that will end, and there's no guarantee when that ending moment will come. So I think it's about taking life, taking what you're good at, taking what you love, taking what enriches the life as you live it, taking your potential and making the most of it. And so I'm prepared to allow risk into that space, because I've gained so much by putting myself in some fairly pushy situations, not every day, not every week or month or year. Most of my life is fairly sensible. But by pushing my limits, I've done so much more, both in mountains and in business and in relationships than if I'd been careful.
That's good. I got a couple questions off that, and just thinking about that experience. What is maybe a top takeaway to go through something like that? And I guess maybe a combination of that, as I'm thinking about this, is what might be something surprising that you really need to make something like that successful? When I hear you talking about the argument of the team and stuff, I'm like, oh man, that sounds like disaster on its way. Because to me, the people around you is going to be key for success. So what are some of the keys for success on something like that?
I found a strong key has been to rack up successes as I go, and to have more than one objective. So it's not actually just the summit and coming home as the two objectives. I'm almost always on a project hoping to learn. And so on Everest, obviously I was learning about climbing high altitude mountains. I was also, I didn't realize it, learning a whole lot about team dynamics and managing big egos in stressful situations. And I went on to make what is now like a 25-year career out of that knowledge. So, Everest set up my adult career and allowed me to go on and live an extraordinary life. But half of the value wasn't just the climbing. It was that trauma and that conflict and what I learned about the dynamics between people, what works, what doesn't. So, okay, that's a slight there's value to be found in difficulty and failure if you can kind of look back on it in a reasonably neutral way and evaluate it without feeling too caught up with your personal ego of the failure. But on all projects, I'm hoping to learn. So I'm always hoping that I'll meet new challenges, or I'm specifically know that I will learn new skills. So whether we succeed or fail, I'll come away more experienced and with more skills than I had before.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And on the way up the mountain, I'm not just endlessly looking at, oh God, how far it still is to the summit, which some people do. I'm looking at, yeah, right, got it. Base camp, we're there. Camp 1, camp 2, whatever it is. And again, the skills I'm learning, like, that was interesting. I know more about how to manage that situation. I'm getting a chance to test practically whatever it is, my navigation, my weather assessment, my snow assessment. Or I'm getting to understand more about how people react in this particular difficult situation. How could we manage that better another time? So that way, I'm disappointed if it fails. And, I don't like people who go like, well, you didn't manage to do that, did you? It takes a certain self-confidence to try to say, well, yeah, okay, you're right. But it's a bunch of other stuff that I got from that experience. And it was worth it.
Okay. That's very good. Yeah, no, I like that. That makes a lot of sense that there's so much learning in the process and in the trying. Have you ever gone too far where you really knew like that, hey, that was too much, where you kind of come back from have a regret where you're like, maybe that was a lesson there, but it was something that you're like, yeah, that's probably, that taught me something that I didn't expect.
Absolutely. I've done the considered retreat, which is when you go like, no, this whole thing is getting too risky and too dangerous. We need to get ourselves out of this situation, which can be tricky. It's not like running a marathon. You just stop and call a taxi. Climbing, you've got to basically reverse yourself out of dangerous situations. So I've done that, and that always actually frankly feels like a success. We recognized it, we got ourselves out. But I've also done the ones where in retrospect it's like, we were lucky to get away with that. I was lucky to get away with that. And those are absolutely learning experiences. I actually think the most dangerous are the things when you got away with something and you don't even realize.
Yeah.
Backcountry skiing is particularly like that because most avalanches are triggered by our own body weight. So you could have skied across a slope that was avalanche prone and you just missed the trigger point. So you think of that as good judgment. It didn't avalanche. Clearly we were right. Actually, you were wrong. You shouldn't have been skiing that slope. You were just incredibly lucky to miss the trigger point. So those are the failures that scare me, the ones where we don't even realize we failed because we think we got it right and we didn't.
Okay, that's good. So I want to make sure I can kind of bring around all the. So you made it to Everest once, but not just once. You went again, and from the other side, and you were the first woman to do that, I believe. Was there?
Yes.
I guess I want to hear kind of the wrap up of Everest and some of that learning that happened through that process.
Well, once again, I wasn't trying to be the first woman to climb it from both sides, which frankly, as a climber, is a slightly odd record. Like a lot of modern firsts, it doesn't mean that much. It's certainly not the same as being, Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay and the first people to climb Everest.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean it had no value. So actually, this was complicated. I was trying to climb K2. We didn't really have enough experience. We wanted another big mountain, one of like the top 6 in the world. Couldn't raise the sponsorship. But companies were saying Everest, we'd sponsor an Everest expedition. It's like, well, we've done Everest. But, a lot of the time you have to be practical. Those Venn diagrams. You've got the circle, which is your passion. And you've got the circle, which is practical, or you can pay for it or whatever it is. And you're looking for the overlap.
Mm-hmm.
So the overlap was the sponsors wanted Everest. We wanted a new mountain. If we went to the other side of Everest, different country, different geology, different weather, the two routes literally meet on the summit. You don't even get the same view until you step onto the summit. So it's like we get a new mountain, effectively, just has the same name. And they get Everest. So it's where passion and practicality overlapped. That's why we went back to Everest.
That's good. I like that combination there. And as you look back at that, what's one of your top takeaways from that experience?
What I found interesting, okay, that's a 2-expedition experience. As in, the first attempt we failed. We got caught up in another team's tragedy very high on the mountain. So we went back a year later, which meant this was now the 3rd Everest expedition, and we succeeded. So where my first Everest summit was just this extraordinary culmination, in the space of about 5 months, I'd gone from this hobby climber who'd never been higher than 6,000 meters to the first South African of either sex to climb Everest. It's like, okay, that's a whiplash change of circumstance. And it was this incredibly controversial, complicated experience. The second summit was now the culmination of 2 years worth of sponsorship raising and planning and team creation, because I was basically a co-leader on these second projects. And I expected to get to the summit on that final expedition when we did. So I had much more confidence, and I felt as if I'd climbed a mountain. It wasn't just the physical mountain. It was a mountain about business and money management and project management and fundraising and media management. So 3 years later, I was much more confident as a young adult in the business space. And I was now 3 years into this journey of being self-employed, raising sponsorship, selling corporate speeches, turning my experiences into stories. I had a book out. I went on to write a much better second book. So it was a very different summit.
And when did that, I guess that kind of shifted for you? Because, the first one was like, here's an opportunity, I'm going for it, see what comes of it. Now, as you're talking, hey, this is a business, this is my thing, and I'm leveraging all this adventure with story and speaking and other things. Can you take us to that transition, when that happened or how that happened exactly? And when you say, yeah, this really can be something for me.
Well, I had no idea that people got, or certainly, adventurers or people, life experience people, got paid money to tell stories to business. Like, what's that about? But as I said, the first Everest expedition, so controversial, before I even got home, speaker bureaus, which are companies who source interesting speakers for corporate events, corporate clients, were already phoning my parents saying, do you think she can give a speech? Do you think she'd be interested? And of course, I'd been lecturing at university. One thing I could do was give a speech. I wasn't afraid of public speaking. So initially, it's just, honestly, they're buying corporate gossip. It's so the board members, like everyone with executive leadership, are as curious as anybody else about what actually happened. And they were just buying an hour of gossip, brought to the company. So quite a lot of people, from Olympic athletes to mountain climbers, end up with 15 minutes of fame. And if you can't give a good speech, that 15 minutes dies pretty quickly. And they stop calling. There are some people who are so famous that it doesn't matter that they don't give a terribly good speech. I believe the first man on the moon was like that. Not a terribly good speaker, but nobody cared. For the rest of his life, they just wanted to have been in the same room as the first man to walk on the moon. But for people like us who are not that famous, you've got this 15 minutes in which you get a chance to say, can you give a good speech? And I could. I liked it. I found it interesting. The next question is, can you make it a speech that's kind of relevant to business? Because, fairly soon your story is history. It's last year's news. Someone else is doing something adventurous or unlikely or controversial. And I had a friend who ran one of those teamwork activity companies where they take executives out for the day and climb ropes and build rafts and things.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So he took me out to lunch after Everest and listened to me whine for about 4 hours about all the conflict in the team. Like, I couldn't believe that adults acted like that and what happened to us, and so unusual. And he was like, yeah. go away and read Ken Blanchard, who was a business guru at the time, still is, the 1-minute manager guy. And he had at that point his famous cycle of team development: forming, storming, norming, performing. And Chris just went, yeah, you guys are such a classic case study. You're a cliche for forming, storming. You just appear to have stormed very badly and out of control. But then, those of you who stuck with it, then normed, and then eventually, particularly after the big storm, managed to kick up into high performance. It's like, So then I went away and used that as the skeleton, not in super obvious ways, not like, and now we are moving from norming to storming. But I made it the skeleton that underlay the speech and made the idea around team development the value of the speech. So this is not me. It's not a story about, look how good I am. I went and conquered Everest. Be inspired by me. I think maybe you can sell that. It's a little easier to sell that to American audiences who do like personal achievement stories. Europeans and South Africa's kind of British culture, they just get super cynical about that. Yeah, God, who are you to, go on about your inspirational story? I'm not going to be inspired by you. Europeans can be very cynical. So in the European and South African market, you want to sell leadership, you want to sell team management. And so all that conflict that had been so awful at the time, gold mine of content when it came to crafting stories with lessons afterwards. Same with writing a book. If nothing goes wrong on your expedition, it's a kind of boring story.
Yeah. So how do you craft that story then? Now we're moving to the story side of things. From a personal experience that we talked a little bit before, that sometimes life doesn't have that nice story arc of the conflict and you overcome it and the success at the end. Life just sometimes moves along from moment to moment. It doesn't feel like a story. So how do you move that from what your experience was into the story and then these lessons?
It's challenging because life doesn't meet the story structure. We don't normally have conclusions or learn lessons, and in the end, it's not actually true that the bad guys get what's coming to them or the good guys get the rewards for all their work. Sometimes it just doesn't happen like that. And I actually think it's one of the reasons we as a species like story so much, because it imposes order on a life experience that is actually rather depressingly disordered and dysfunctional and, in my opinion, largely without conclusion. We make conclusion for ourselves. So in telling a good story, it needs an arc. It needs a journey from a starting place to end somewhere different. A life has been changed in some way. And then that journey needs twists and turns. So what you essentially need is a set of obstacles of some kind, physical or emotional or interpersonal, that will arise, preferably unexpectedly, and will have to be overcome. So you want your readers, your audience, to go through a roller coaster. You want the series of you've overcome one problem and then you promptly get sideswiped by the next one. And preferably you do eventually want a happy ending. It's a little harder when you're crafting a life experience that doesn't have a happy ending. Then you kind of have to turn it into lessons learned.
Yeah.
Not quite as satisfying. So on one hand, that Everest story absolutely had the journey from the kind of the token woman novice to the first South African to climb Everest. It had all sorts of obstacles, self-created ones within the team, external ones, the big storm. It had these comebacks, our first attempt at the summit, our second attempt. It had, unexpected story elements. Nelson Mandela suddenly phones out of the blue. It had lovely drama. It had eventual success. And then someone got killed on the way down. That's not part of a classic, a feel-good conclusion. And it was hard for many years to talk about Bruce's death, because not to talk about it kind of didn't honor the experience and made it sound as if we'd done something different from what actually happened. To talk about it glibly made it sound like I didn't care. And But to talk about it honestly was emotionally really hard. To stand up in front of 200 strangers, and you're being paid to do this, and kind of remine your own trauma and worry and guilt. That's hard to do, honestly. And the other thing is the corporate audience didn't turn up for a huge downer or be to kind of do therapy around my trauma, around the situation. So I can only give them so much honesty before they start going like, yeah, no, this isn't what we wanted on our stage. We wanted success. So it took a couple of years to kind of feel that I decided that the point, the lesson that made it a story worth hearing without being too just traumatic was a story about summit fever and what really matters in life. The point being, so you run a story that's all about achieving a goal, and businesses are desperately goal-orientated. But then you take a step back and say, there were actually two goals here, and we lost one by being too focused on the other. We lost a life because we were too focused on reaching the summit. And sometimes what matters isn't any one immediate achievement. It's the big picture. It's knowing what you want, not just this year, but 5 years from now, 25 years from now. What's the long-term vision for your life, your company, your journey? And interestingly, that message became even more resonant after the 2008 financial crash, because that was a lot of very short-term thinking by a bunch of bankers and investment advisors and basically wealthy people who were managing the world's money and chasing very short-term returns on very high-risk ventures. And the damage they did to all of us was enormous because they lost sight of the big picture. Yeah. What do we want the society to look like in 5 years, in 25 years, a century from now? There's not always a message that my corporate clients think they want to hear, but I think it's one that's good for them to hear. And it resonates with the audiences who often feel a little too pressured by the leadership to achieve the next goal very, very fast and possibly indulge in some slightly ethically dubious behavior to make it work.
Yeah, I like that. And you actually tap into an area, because I've asked this question from other guests, is that one thing I found is that as our own story, there's a lot of, I guess, untapped potential as we look at our own story, our own life story, and examine different parts of it. And I found this in my own self, even some short stories in my life, to re-examine them and to pull them out and look at it again. I found value in there. But I've always questioned on the hard stuff, the difficult things. I think there's a lot of value there too. And so my question is, how do you do pull that out? And you're tapping into it with a story here about the death of Bruce. And how do you work through? Do you have any insights on how you work through that and how you get it to the place where you're not hiding it, you're not suppressing it, but you actually dealt with it in a healthy way?
I don't know what the answer to that is. It's the experience and what it meant to me changes over the years. So a story isn't just what happened in the moment. I mean, there's always some level of objective truth, but how we feel about it, what we think it means, changes forever. You will think about it differently in each decade of your life, as the years go by. I don't know. I think I'm lucky in that I'm reasonably pragmatic. Possibly I'm too pragmatic. I do remember being criticized because I failed to cry on national television when talking about Bruce. And clearly that's not how decent women are supposed to deal with tragedy. Men can go on TV and not cry, but women clearly can't, because that makes you a callous bitch or an ice queen or something. So, the first problem is we don't always deal with grief the way other people think we ought to deal with grief. I think I'm able to be reasonably detached, so I can look back on an experience and feel like we made mistakes, I made mistakes, I do something differently next time, I've learned something. But I'm not one of these people who then rehashes this almost the intrusive thought but I should have, I wish have, if only, I can't believe I didn't. I'm able to put the past into the past and move forward. And I know some people find that difficult. I don't, it must be really hard to be trapped in your own past like that. I don't know what the answer to that is. It does help to talk it through, but there's almost a point where you've talked it through so much. Some of the things in my past where I've talked and talked and talked and talked, and Everest is part of that, to corporate audiences, in speeches, to journalists, writing books, writing articles, it's almost become mythologized. And I sometimes wonder whether I remember what genuinely happened or whether I remember the story that I've been telling. Because you have to simplify. Nobody's there to listen to a, minute by minute, 24/7 recounting of your 3 months on Everest. I mean, who's got the time? Nobody cares. But in telling the story, you simplify it, you clarify it, you lose nuance, you leave out details. And eventually, I don't know whether I'm remembering the stories I tell or I'm remembering the genuine event anymore.
No, that's a good point. I mean, you combine that with our memories and how we've, done a lot of research recently about our memories, and they're not what we think they are. And so
exactly.
We don't remember as quite as well as we think we remember. So that's an interesting point.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm interested in that science as well. It's not a hard drive. It's not as if there's a clean recording that we can find if we just dig down the file folder. We actually remake the memory each time we access it. And given that we access it with the concerns of our life now, whatever that may be, and the experiences we've had between then and now, we remake the memory of the experience every time we think about it.
That's interesting, though. I have to dig more into that in the future here, because I've heard also it presented that the memory is not for just recall of an event, but actually our memory, maybe this evolutionary purpose of memory is to learn from. So you don't have to have that perfect recall of the event to keep learning from it. Maybe that's an interesting side thing on there. I don't know, something to look into for sure. I guess I want to come up to, before we run out of time here, come to where you're at today. What's going on with your work today, and how it's been some years since Everest, I believe. So
it's been many years since Everest.
I'm sure there's a lot more story in your life that we're not going to be able to touch into, but let's hear where you're at today, and I guess specifically how people can connect with you if they want to hear more about you, Cathy.
Well, okay, we'll do a very brief epilogue to the story. I climbed Everest from both sides, got that slightly odd record. I'd never walk into a room full of climbers and announce myself as the first woman to climb Everest from both sides. But in the corporate space or on the front of a book, very useful. The tagline, the one sentence that explains why you're important or why people might be interested in your story. So there's no doubt that opened a lot of doors for me. I spent 5 years in South Africa speaking, raising sponsorship money, wrote a first book for a publisher under huge time pressure after the first Everest expedition. Didn't like it at all. It was written too quickly. I hadn't had time to process the experience. So I think it's a very unsubtle book. I'm glad it's out of print. I moved to Europe after about 5 years because I just was battling to raise enough money in South Africa to do these things and to earn enough money. Managed to translate the speaking into a worldwide audience based out of Europe, which has been amazing. I think I've now been paid to speak in 44 countries. So I got to travel the world off the back of Everest, of giving corporate speeches. I wrote a second book, which is much better, called Just for the Love of It. Partly because I was sick of men writing books about Everest called things like Killer Mountain and The Death Zone, real macho, overcoming difficulty books. It's like, I actually had fun. I mean, some of it was traumatic, but overall I climbed because I love it. So I tried to write a book that was more emotionally honest, that had more of the joy of climbing. That's why it's called Just for the Love of It. That's a pretty good book, still in print. I get enough in royalties to buy myself a nice lunch about once every 6 months. Unless you're John Krakauer and wrote into thin air, you don't make money in adventure books that's going to pay off your mortgage, but you do with the corporate speeches. So for over 20 years, I've lived off keynote speaking, which has left me a lot of free time to go and climb mountains. I've done other things in the Himalaya. The last big expedition was a 20,000-foot peak in Canada, which we did on skis, Mount Logan. So still trying to learn new things. In this case, it was taking skis to altitude. And I then get a bunch of younger adventurers, climbers, like, how do I do that? How do I find the money for the dream? And then I've done something interesting. How do I make any money back to pay off my debts? So I set up a website called The Business of Adventure to talk about money. In the corporate space, I'm kind of inspiration come sort of some basic executive insights. But in the venture space, I left inspiration to other people. I wanted somebody to speak really practically and pragmatically about money. How do we pay for this? How do we make a living? And so much of it is about the crafting of story. It's about taking an experience. Whether it's before an adventure and you're crafting a pitch to a sponsor or to media partners, or after the adventure and you're trying to turn the adventure into a book, a film, a speech. So much of it is about the ability to articulate a story. So I've got great resources on thebusinessofadventure.com, the website. And then my personal social media, where I share stories mostly through photographs, climbing, skiing, and some of my speaking. Twitter and Instagram at Cathy O'Dowd, and then the website cathyo'dowd.com.
All right. Well, Cathy, I wish I could keep talking to you about more of this and hearing your insights, not just the adventure itself, but the insights you've gained and the intelligence that you speak through that. So, I want to thank you for being on StoryHinge. And I guess I want to give you one more thing, and I guess the last word. And someone's out there at a crossroads. What would be your advice to that person?
I want to say, take the leap. At the crossroad, take whichever path feels bigger, more frightening, leading to somewhere more remote. But I'm also a big believer in doing that in a way that's practical. So I'm not, a lot of the inspirational people in adventure are like, just go forth. Throw your fears to the wind, $25 in your back pocket. Like, yeah. You're a nice middle-class white guy who doesn't have student debt and has middle-class parents with a credit card who'll bail you out if it all goes wrong. And you've got a first world passport, which makes it a whole lot easier. A lot of us don't have those advantages. So let's go slightly more modest one. Don't look at what other people have managed to do. Look at where you are now. And start to walk yourself towards somewhere that for you feels a bit bigger, a bit dangerous, a bit of a push, while being realistic and accepting about the limitations that come with who you are, where you are in life, how much money you have, what the opportunities. The best time to have started your journey was last year, but if you haven't, the next best time is now.
Yeah.
Take a step today, take a step tomorrow. Those silly 20 centimeter steps we take. They'll get you up Everest. They'll get you around the world. A year from now, 10 years from now, they'll get you to somewhere quite extraordinary.
Oh, beautiful. That's beautifully said. Well, Cathy, thank you for spending time with us here on StoryHinge.
It's been an absolute pleasure.
All right. Thank you, Cathy, for spending time with us at StoryHinge. And thank you to all of you listeners out there. If you want to connect with Cathy, you can do so at CathyO'Dowd.com. And also for the business side on adventure, it's thebusinessofadventure.com. And those links will be in the show notes and on the website. So if you want to click into that, you can do it there. A few thoughts as we close out today. Really enjoyed this conversation with Cathy. I thought there were some really good insights into living life well. And the first one was, seize those opportunities and experience. And we often have this concept that, we're reaching a goal, we have to get the grade, that the completion is the ultimate reward. And sometimes it is, but I really liked her life's experience in explaining some of that, how, there's a goal that gives us focus and direction on our journey. But along the journey, there's lots of rewards along the way if we recognize it. And so I think it's important that we do, and to have those learning moments along the way. And also on top of that, sometimes that goal changes as we're going down that journey. It's like, well, that was the goal, but now I need to shift and move the goal somewhere else because that's where it's at now. And that's okay. And I guess sometimes we can classify those as failures, right? We didn't reach the ultimate goal or the goal that we were heading for at a certain time. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that. Maybe it's just a new redirection in life, and that's okay. I guess one other thing is this idea of keeping that long-term view, the big view in mind as we're going along. Sometimes we get caught too myopic and focused on the short term or the immediate. And that was one other thing that touched me through this interview. You guys, I hope you're having a great week out there, great 2 weeks, as we're now at a 2-week cycle here at StoryHinge. And so I invite you to, of course, subscribe to the podcast, share it with others. I guess maybe I'll just give you kind of update what's going on here. This has been really enjoyable for me this season 2 in StoryHinge, and still doing interviews with different people and their different experiences, but diving a little bit more into story, and hopefully trying to bring some value to you out there in terms of your personal story and what makes a good story. I'll continue to do that. I already have some guest interview completed along those lines, and a few different ones along some more personal interests that'll be coming out here shortly. And I think I mentioned before also that I've started another podcast with my brother called 73 Mentors, and that's where we're diving deeper into the 73 most influential people who have ever lived, and examining their lives and their works and trying to draw out of that value for our current life today. And that one's a little more, I guess, probably in depth, and not an interview format, but a real research and discussion format. So I invite you to check that out if that sounds interesting to you. Again, 73 Mentors. You can find that there. And you guys, most of all, just hope you're having a great week. And no matter where you're at, I hope you take a step. I think Cathy mentioned that through her discussion. Take a step in the right direction, or try the direction you know you need to take. You guys have a great one. We'll catch you in 2 weeks.
Thank you for sharing with us at StoryHinge. We hope this time together has added more goodness to your journey. Until next time, onward and upward, and may your own story continue to grow more beautiful.